Assalamualaikum, Qasim. Sorry, I think my phone froze up a second ago, but wanted to talk about this horrible attack in Istanbul that has left 32 dead and dozens more injured. Um, Particularly devastating in these final few days of Ramadan. These are considered the most holy days of the year for Muslims, and their sacredness can't be underestimated. To conceive that someone would violate these holy days for their barbaric political, economic, nationalistic reasons is inconceivable. The Quran permits fighting in self-defense, and even in that situation forbids Muslims from fighting in the month of Ramadan, even in self-defense. Even then they're asked to try to abstain from fighting and only fight in the month of Ramadan as an absolute last resort in self-defense. And so to consider how corrupt these individuals are and how far they are removed from the compassionate example set forth by the Holy Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, it's absolutely inconceivable. I have many Turkish friends. My heart goes out to them. My prayers go out to them. I really can't express my pain and my anger at this point. There's a feeling of helplessness I think a lot of people have too, which I think is natural in these kinds of situations. But the only way that we're going to be able to get through this is, a lot of what we've talked about over the years. We need to maintain justice in our international relations, in our dialogue with one another. We need to maintain education at the forefront of how we work. We need to remember the elements of compassion and empathy and sympathy in how we dialogue with one another. Without these elements, we're in a lot of trouble. I think my frustration is that I see Muslim leaders issue these condemnations, which I guess they're good, but to what extent, right? I mean, if we're not consistently leading by example with our governments, with our countries, then issuing these empty condemnations isn't going to do anything. And I'll give you an example, a perfectly good example, my own birth country of Pakistan. You have these clerics there that will issue these condemnations against terrorism, but in the very next breath, they'll promote death for apostasy laws and death for blasphemy laws. And there's an inherent contradiction. When you raise an entire society with the belief that might is right, that I can kill you if I disagree with you because I have a gun and you don't, and then expect people to be peaceful, it's an inherent contradiction. You're not going to create a peaceful society doing that. You're going to, in fact, create more violence and more terrorism. And that burden I put on Muslim leadership, because it was unfortunately Muslim leadership who passed these death for blasphemy and death for apostasy laws in Pakistan. That's why since 9/11 you've seen, I think the last I checked was something close to 70,000 people that have been killed by terrorism in Pakistan. 70,000, think about that, 70,000 people. We're talking 32 here in Turkey, which is devastating beyond comprehension. Think about the fact that in the last 15 years, 70,000 people in Pakistan have died in acts of terrorism. And you can issue all the empty condemnations you want. You can write it in gold, you can carve it in stone. But what's the point? What's that going to solve? All it's going to do is going to show inconsistency. Why is there so many problems in that region, and why do they do this? I just don't get it. This is the corruption that Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, foretold, that in the latter days the Muslim clerics will be the most corrupt people, corrupt creatures. He didn't even use the word people. He said they will be the most corrupt creatures on the face of the earth. that they will create fitna and fasad, chaos and disorder. And this is exactly what we're seeing. They are creating the most chaotic and disordered situation that you can envision. And they're doing it, claiming to do it by following Islam, which a cursory understanding of Islam demonstrates that they have bastardized the entire religion. This isn't Islam that they're following. It's their own political ideology. It's their own concoction. Nothing in Islam justifies this. And, I think the biggest proof of their insecurity, of their incompetence, of their incoherence is the fact that they have passed these vehement laws of censorship, forbidding any kind of dialogue. Yeah, somebody mentioned that these actors in Pakistan are experiencing this right now. When you can't even talk about persecution anymore, that's when it's gotten really bad. And Turkey is our brother country, absolutely. These things are happening not by accident. They're happening because you have corrupt leadership who isn't accountable, who isn't reliable, who isn't dependable, who isn't knowledgeable, and all they're focused on is lining their pocketbooks with more money, with more cash, with more favors, with more support, with more power. And religion or not, anytime you have that kind of a scenario, you're going to have innocent life lost. And let's be perfectly candid, it's not unlike here in the United States, where we have, for example, 1,000 women who are killed every year by violent abusers. Why does that continue to happen year after year after year? This is a corruption in the kind of message that we're sending to our youth, and we're not giving them the guidance and tools that they need, and they're empowering themselves to commit these kinds of atrocities. Tim says, in my home country, Northern Ireland, the violence ended once legitimate grievances were addressed, namely Catholic nationalists having been treated as second-class citizens for decades. The problem was political and economic, not religious. Tim, that's exactly correct. That is exactly right. When you have people being treated like second-class citizens, they're gonna be put in a tough spot. But even if they don't respond violently, which is often the case, that the minority doesn't respond violently. What's often the case is that the violent majority tries to enforce their power even more. And this is what's happening in Pakistan. You have this violent ideology from Sunni clerics, and they're inspiring the majority to continue to persecute the minority. That's just a reality of what we're seeing right now. And until and unless we make some kind of a strict change, we can't expect this to have any kind of immediate impact. And that's my fear, that we're teaching a new generation of youth that might is right, and that's the frightening thing. But where does the corruption originate? You can study this from an academic standpoint, and I've written on this in detail in Pakistan. The corruption originated in Pakistan when you began to mix mosque and state. In 1953, clerics led by this terrorist Mullah Maududi tried to convince the government to pass religious edicts as constitutional amendments. The government pushed away and said, no, we're not going to do it. And you can see the next 20 years, from 53 to 74, Pakistan lived in relative peace. After 74, Pakistan started to pass laws criminalizing religious behavior that was private faith. So, for example, they passed their Second Amendment, which made it illegal for Ahmadiyya Muslims to refer to themselves as Muslim. And the result of this was it empowered extremists even more. It empowered dictator Zia-ul-Haq to come to power and not only hang Bhutto, who passed the Second Amendment, but then passed the death for blasphemy and death for apostasy laws. So this doesn't happen overnight. It happens over a period of weeks, months, years, even decades. But it happens slowly because people are apathetic and because extremists continue to push the agenda little by little. This is why it's so dangerous here in the United States that we have a legitimate candidate for president who has essentially empowered racists to promote the racism and bigotry. This is why the racism behind the Brexit vote is so dangerous, because it is inching people towards fascism, towards being empowered. They passed that law because the Ahmadiyya Muslim community are Muslims who believe that the awaited Messiah and Mahdi has come. And these were religious clerics who were furious that someone would make such a claim. And rather than engage in dialogue and debate, they engage in censorship and violence. This is the history of humanity. In every single era of humanity, whenever a man came and claimed that God had sent him, he was met with violent opposition. And the response to that violent opposition was education, was compassion and peace. But during that process, many innocent lives are lost because the violent opposition spreads like a cancer. Tara Khan says, Pakistan and a few other countries call themselves an Islamic Republic. This creates an authority on people who can be claimed as a Muslim or not. The government sets this tone. Exactly. I mean, religion and state need to be separate. Simple as that. There should be no mixing of mosque and state. And this is not some 21st century liberal Muslim idea. This is the example Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, set forth in the Charter of Medina. This was a secular constitution. He had sovereign authority. He could have enforced Islam. If Islam taught compulsion in religion, if Islam taught to force people to accept what you believe, that would have been the time to do it. But he did the exact opposite. Luis, yeah, I hear Christians claiming others can't be Christian if you vote so-and-so. Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's nonsense. I always learn listening to chats. I knew about the persecution of the Ahmadiyya community, but did not realize how deep it went. But what can we do to change it? Lauren, it goes really deep. I mean, we're talking just about every Muslim majority country, Ahmadi Muslims are persecuted, either through state or social means. And to stop it, it's going to require consistency in our message. It's going to require education of the masses. And part of the problem right now, why education is so difficult, is because so many of these countries have enacted censorship. So the official website of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, alislam.org, has been censored in countries like Pakistan. You can't access it. And people look at the situation like Turkey and say, well, that was an isolated incident. And what they're not realizing is that these extremists are coming from somewhere. As I wrote in my peer-reviewed paper in 2011, Pakistan's violations of the ICCPR, what they are doing is, in fact, creating an environment of radicalization that is spreading overseas as well. Indonesia, for example, has seen some terrorism, and it traces back to Pakistan. And this is frightening. Afghanistan, same thing. Even before the war, you saw some of this extremism coming from Pakistan, and that's extremely dangerous. Jim says, for extremists to win, the easiest way is to point to different ones and label them the enemy. That's exactly right. What do you say about Ahmad Sabri killing in Karachi? He is an innocent person. Zohaib, you're absolutely right, and that's beyond tragic. That now people who have contributed so much good are being killed in cold blood. It was extremely tragic to see him go in such a horrible way. No one deserves that. I mean, it's really painful. If religion and state need to be together, then the state should recognize and follow true religious teaching of universal compassion and tolerance towards other beliefs. Shafiq, I mean, I see your point, but religion and state don't need to be together. I mean, your religion is personal. It shouldn't affect you how somebody else practices their religion, as long as how they're practicing their religion doesn't interfere with your personal space, your personal rights. I mean, whether I pray 5 times a day or 10 times a day, it should be irrelevant to anyone else. Whether I pray towards Jerusalem or pray towards Mecca or don't pray at all should be irrelevant to anyone else. I think personal godliness is important, but it needs to remain personal. And a government, I think, should certainly follow an infrastructure of morals and ethics, but it shouldn't have to answer to any kind of religious body or any kind of religious clerics, because the second that you start doing that, you start to enforce religion, which defeats the point of it being religion. I mean, it just defeats the point of it altogether. So, that's where these extremist mullahs refuse to budge, because they know if they do, they're going to lose their political power. And that inherently admits that they're not worried about religion, they're worried about their political power. And that's the problem. So, anyway, down in this final minute, deepest prayers and remorse for the people of Turkey. They've seen numerous attacks in the last year, and it is beyond painful, beyond devastating. As a Muslim, I believe that these killers will be brought to justice in this life or the next. The Quran teaches that to kill one person is to kill all humanity. And in Ramadan, Muslims are forbidden from even arguing and debating on petty things, let alone fighting, let alone killing innocent people, which is inconceivable. It's not that I do not understand this rhetoric as being evil. It is stupid and for hatred, for death. There is no benefit. Can you explain the benefit? Because the benefit that these mullahs have in 5 seconds is that they don't want to allow the message of a man who claimed to be he was from God to spread. And this is what the Quran says, that alas for my messengers, alas for my people, never does a messenger come, but they mock at him. If you want to email me, I can send you some more thoughts on this. But I'm going to bounce out. Prayers to Turkey. Please remember them in your prayers, especially in these final few days of Ramadan, these holy days. May there be peace, and may we learn to live together and stop this barbaric, pathetic terrorism. Assalamu alaikum.